Watch a movie, get inspired, give back, help a charity. It's time for a Movikarma watch party. As we think about, you're talking about talking to students and young people about their own futures and telling stories as I hear you that are authentic to them, authentic to their story and where they come from. What do you see as some of the biggest barriers or gaps in terms of, and that I imagine you see many, as do we, in terms of empowering underrepresented filmmakers and writers of color and LGBTQ folks who don't historically have access?
You just said it, access and
Yeah,
resources.
yeah,
Right? People are always like, oh, you can film a thing on an iPhone, and you can. And it's really great that you can do that. If you can't upload it to a platform, though, if you don't have the means to compress it so that it, fits within a certain time limit on the various free platforms, um, if you can't get it seen, if you don't have the tools to refine what you're doing, right? Like there are a lot of people who have like raw talent, but you can't just go out with a camera, film a whole bunch of stuff, stick it together, and hope that we sit through and watch it.
right.
You, and so it's access and resources. It really is. And so trying to get folks that access and those resources can be tough, because again, the capitalism says that it celebrates the individual, but what capitalism really does is it actually turns everybody on the individual, right? Because it'll pick one person out and say that person is the person to represent, and everybody else kind of has to, want for that space,
Mm.
right? Supply and demand, and if they don't want for it, then the system doesn't work. Whereas when we think about these more equitable systems that share resources, that share access, the sort of competition dies down, and then you sort of think, and then folks can kind of get the learning, the practice that they need. It's one of the things I talk about all the time, is that when I talk about resources, I don't necessarily just mean money, right? I mean the ability to practice.
Mm.
And many folks know, um, but I think early filmmakers don't know how long it actually takes to edit just 2 minutes of footage, right? It
Right.
takes a long time, and if you
Yeah.
got to stop and let it render and go do it, and do a job somewhere and come back, you're not getting the practice of consistently just working on your craft. Similarly to a musician, if you can't just sit down at the keys, or you don't have access to keys to a piano, you've got to go and rent them, or that those barriers, those little, what we call those little walls, those, not the big ones, not the great ones, not the ones that are insurmountable, but the little ones that are just about time, just about practice, just about access. um, those can be equally as problematic as the larger ones, of like, oh yeah, well, no one gave me a $3 million budget to film this film, right? um, Equally on the $100 budget, or the $50,000 budget, it, though there can be so many steps in between that stop people. Transportation,
Mm-hmm.
we take for granted folks living in areas with great transportation to get to where they need to go to. So yeah, we have to, if we look more granularly or
Mm-hmm.
smaller, I think we help those artists, or those people who want to be artists, or even producers, get a sense of what they'll need to do the work, and then we can help them take down the smaller barriers between what's their goal and them.
Yeah, I love that you brought it down almost a microscopic or a real human level, because as someone like you described, I mean, who we've created short films and indie pilots, and the amount of work in the team that you need to build, even for small projects, and the amount of resources you need, and as you said, practice to learn your craft is a real challenge if you're working 2, 3 jobs, or you're struggling to make ends meet.
Yeah, I mean, and I think your point about, or the word that you use, your teams, right? It's we always think, oh well, these independent artists got together and they did this thing. Well, so and so's family is bankrolled,
Mm.
and they don't actually have to work. So,
Right.
the fact that they get a trust fund salary every year, which is great and good for them, but your team is if your team isn't made up of people who have the time and experience to help you, right? That those become other barriers. And so that's why I often tell students, hey, look around you. Who are the people in high school that you're building with right now? Because now you've got access and resources in ways that other folks won't, and that you won't once you become an adult, right? And so it'll, look out for that person who has been there, uh, finding locations for you to shoot every time, right? Um, that may be that may be your location persons for the rest of your life, and there's no greater experience than working with someone who you both have learned how to do this, and you now are in community together, and you care about their family, they care about your family, they care about the work you make. That kind of working environment can only be better for artists than sort of um, everybody's a sort of a gun for hire, for lack of a better term, which I wish they would come up with a better term. But
Yeah, I wish they would too. No, I mean, I relate to that. And I mean, I have an AD I've worked with for every project who's just, kind of whatever you need, Jared. Like I believe in what your stories you're telling. So I think that's such a good point. And it's something we're trying to do actively through mentorship and spotlighting and support. Uh, and so I wonder, do you feel like, obviously you mentioned the resource gaps, the resource issues. I think we touched a little bit on mentorship that you had, that I've had, I'm sure many of us have had. What other gaps do you see? I mean, obviously there's the real issues of systemic racism. You talked about privilege issues of folks just being born into the industry and then having the keys kind of laid out in front of them. What other challenges and issues do you see in terms of access and inclusion, and a lot of things the industry maybe is starting to talk about or finally talking about?
well, I mean, the most marginalized folks that I've witnessed in the industry are women, and particularly Black women and Native American women. Um, I mean, even with the reason I say that is because I've seen them have access to resources and still not be listened to. I've seen them have the time and practice and still be regarded as kind of second tier rather than top tier. So even with all the things that we talked about in terms of barriers and resource and gaps, but then watching a person simply because of who they are, be mitigated to not quite as professional, or I've heard people, you just hear the language change, and so automatically you're seeing these more roadblocks being put in their way rather than less. I've worked with producers who have been on the ground floor producing and doing a thing for 20 years, and now only just getting their chance to be the boss of something when they behind the scenes they've been running the thing the whole time. And that's wild to me. It's wild to me. But it also means that there's a level of privilege that I have that blinds me from that. And so, I don't know that I can call out any particular thing that happens, but I do know that, and I've seen and witnessed the voices of Black women and Native women be just relegated to nothing sometimes. And that's and that and we've just got, when I see it, when I see it, I do the best I can to kind of go, hey, this person is trying to this person is doing something, let's move. Or, oh, actually I was only raising my hand just to make sure that this person was saying what they need to say. And even that isn't enough. It isn't enough,
It is, I guess the question then is what would be enough in a sense other, I mean, obviously representation in the room. I mean, I was just talking to a Pakistani American producer at HBO who raised this issue of frankly just lack of diversity in the space, lack of people of color in her space, women of color, or if they are able to work with her, then leave quickly, like literally come to her and tell her, I can't do this anymore. So I wonder, and I was asking their same question to her, what is, like, how can we shift that? Is it a question of just having more folks at the table who are women or are women of color? Is it something else in terms of understanding and acceptance from those who are in power at present?
Listen. This. How long have we been doing films?
Yeah.
Film is like 200, almost 200 years old. Film, right? Great, cool. Took us that long to kind of build up the system. It's going to take us equally as long to undo it, right? And so the idea of like, what are the 5 tenets or what are the 10 things we can, everything. Everything. You have to be, every move has to be intentional. It's about making sure that there are people in the room. It's making sure that they're telling the stories that they want to tell. It's making sure that the stories about them are being told, even if they don't want to tell those stories. It's about being intentional about the representation and having a conversation going, oh, I'm looking at our slate and there are no stories about Native American women in it. There are no stories about Black women in a positive light in it or centering them specifically. Well, let's get to, right. That's a good step, but even that's like a step, right? What you really do is go, all right, next year we make sure that, that the population of our films or our projects looks like the population of the world, or of the city we live in, and then the state we live in, and then the country we live in, and then, the world. And if you do that, the global majority is not white.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So if you make films that reflect the world, you have to make it look like the global majority, and you're going to be doing a lot more Asian work. You're going to do a lot more Black work, a lot more African work. You know what I mean? Like but if you set the goal to forever be connected to the change, then that's what you do. But the problem is we're looking for like 4 or 5 things to like undo the uncomfortability, yeah. And that, you can do a whole bunch of things there, but it won't solve the problem.
Yeah, you're tinkering, really. I mean, if that, right?
Yeah, you're just really trying to get back to normal.
Yeah. Do you, on that point, Tarell, do you care to comment on the Academy's inclusion criteria and what they've released?
Not really. I'm not a part of the Academy, yeah. So I don't. So I saw them on Twitter, and I feel bad about that because I was like, oh, let me read these,
yeah,
the other things that I'm doing. So I haven't really looked through them. I mean, I'm glad they're making steps and strides. I haven't processed them enough to look at, what films that would make. Like, I haven't put the equation to anything. So I haven't sat down and gone, okay, well, let's just look at the films that were and weren't nominated in the past so and so years. But I wonder if someone did that, what would that look like, right? I wonder if someone went through and said, okay, which films would be eliminated because of this criteria, and which films might get elevated or shot because of that. And I'd love to see that list.